Good afternoon. It's really lovely to be with all of you today. We look forward to our discussion on better choices, ensuring South Africa's future. We'll be joined today by Mr. Mcebisi Jonas, who's the former Deputy Finance Minister and also the chairperson of MTN. We're shortly expecting to be joined by Professor Haroon Bhorat of UCT to talk about this vital topic. We are going to start, of course, with the arrest of two Gupta brothers last night. That would be Rajesh Tony Gupta and also Atul Gupta. Those two were the brothers who did most of the legwork on that part of the state capture story at Transnet, Eskom, etc. Ajay Gupta, the oldest brother, or who I call the capo, has not yet been arrested. Very welcome, Professor Haroon Bhorat, and congratulations on your book, Better Choices, Ensuring South Africa's Future. Very welcome, Mr. Mcebisi Jonas, chairperson of MTN, on the boards of various companies, and also our former Deputy Minister of Finance. I thought I'd start with you, Mcebisi, and ask, how did you feel last night when you heard that two of the Gupta brothers, one of whom had been presumptuous enough to offer you a bribe, had finally been arrested in Dubai yesterday?
I was excited. I mean, it's a good signal, Ferial, in many respects. I think if you talk to people generally, and the perception across different sectors of society has been that there's been very slow movement in the prosecution and action against the perpetrators of state capture. So I think it does give some hope that we're finally moving in the right direction, and it's a very positive signal for South Africa in general.
That's great. I mean, it's been quite a week, Haroon Bhorat. We've on 2 weeks on the prosecution's front, the investigating directorate obviously finding its feet, and we've seen a range of arrests being made. Some of the kingpins of the capture at Transnet also arrested last week. What's your perception of how South Africa is regarded, not only by the world, but even in our country, just in your circles that you mix in?
Yeah, so Ferial, thanks very much. I mean, it's a broad question, but my sense is that, we often lose perspective as South Africans. We tend to be quite parochial. As a developing country, an emerging market, upper middle income country, we have the same sort of pangs of growth and development that other countries have. They may differ across time in weight, so you may have a particularly big problem around crime or a particularly big problem around, let's say, low growth rates, but we're no different actually to many other developing countries in terms of the constraints we face. And I think in the international community, the international economics community, there's certainly an understanding of that. And I think sometimes as South Africans, we have an exceptionalism that we think makes us very, very different. It's not always the case.
Absolutely. I mean, I know we can be quite navel-gazing, which is why I very much appreciate the book, which the two of you are amongst an editorial team, an editing team of Greg Mills, Mcebisi, Haroon Bhorat, and Ray Hartley, who put together this Better Choices, Ensuring South Africa's Future. It's published by the Brenthurst Foundation, which of course is funded by the Oppenheimer family or by Jonathan Oppenheimer himself. I'm going to ask motivations. I just want to welcome, we're joined by hundreds of people today. Just some welcomes, Jim Powell, Veronica Orme, I hope I have that right, Rupert van Blerk, Jane Hofmeyer, Tumakele Gosa from the Mbado Housing Group, welcome, Nomvula Dlamini, Greg Taylor, Claudia Regnart, Vishanti Sopol, and so on. I hope that we're going to have a great chat today. Gentlemen, do either of you want to just tell me, perhaps we start with you, Mkhe, what was the thinking in putting together a compendium like this. Our problems are very well diagnosed in South Africa. And when I first got it, I thought, why? It's an excellent read, but I did want to know your motivation.
Look, I mean, there are a number of reasons why. I mean, the first, I think, is what you were pointing out, that I think all of us were saying there's a lot written about our problems. Yes. Sometimes diagnosis is so clear. Many people have said this and that. Maybe we quibble over points of emphasis, but generally there is a common and sense that there is a common perception of where the problems are. What the book intended to do was to, in a truncated way, rehash some of those problems, but at the same time focus more on what kinds of actions are necessary to take us out of the morass that we are in. And that I think was the brief that we gave to most of the people who wrote different chapters in the book. And then also this third part was to ensure that you have something practical to engage with the authorities and to engage with those who are in charge of policy and implementation, as it were. So that in a sense, were the broad reasons for getting into the book.
Thank you. May I stay with you for a moment? You're one of the 4 presidential envoys who search for investment to come into South Africa. What's the perception like when you go on road shows? How is our country regarded? What are the key questions that you get asked?
Look, it's a mixed perception. Haroon is right. I think one part of it is that in the last 10 years or so, I think South Africa has not been necessarily an outlier. I think with all developing countries, we almost face the same problems than anybody else. But I guess, I mean, topical in the questions that perceptions that people have is the fear of how sustainable is the reform agenda or reform program is. And I think that's actually kind of based on perceptions of potential political instability. For instance, I mean, what people are saying, is it sustainable? What's likely to happen? Is it driven by one individual, or is it there's a common buy-in into the reform agenda that's driven? The second, I think, concern has been slow pace of the transformation and change that's happening. I mean, again, I mean, you talked about prostitution, but think about it. The country has been grappling with, for instance, if you take in the mining sector, the mining charter, I think it's more than 7 years that there's been a debate on the mining charter, as it were. And the same with Spectrum, for instance. It took, I don't know, more than a couple of years before we reached the point where we resolved the issue, as it were. And I think visas also, I mean, has been another interesting example of where there's been slow pace at least. But I think in the overall, there is still a very optimistic view about South Africa as an emerging market. We still have deep financial markets. I mean, in the continent, we're still leading with deep financial markets. We still also have a very robust private sector, and we still have a very probably dynamic constitution in a sense, and a strong judiciary, so to speak. So all of this, so I'm saying it's a mixed bag. You have concerns about sustainability of where we're going, fear about us tripping into the normal problems faced by most developing countries, and particularly the post-independence Africa. But at the same time, I think there is recognition of the inherent strengths in our society and in our economy, and the resilience of our private sector.
Thank you very much.
Situations.
Thank you, both of you, for making sure that we see ourselves in a context, a global context, in a developing world context. Haroon, I guess when I read ratings agencies, anybody, any assessment, World Bank, anything about South Africa, it's always our super high unemployment rate, which is right up there. And as South Africa's leading labor market economist, how do you answer that question? How do you see it? Do you maybe want to put that slide on we were speaking about earlier, so you can speak to that?
Yeah, so maybe, so the slide, Ferial, is actually really about our low growth trap.
Okay.
But maybe just as I'm happy to sort of see if we can quickly put it up. Just to give, if you can just tell me when you can see it.
There we go. You can see
Okay.
it.
So this is just by way of background in terms of thinking about the labor market, and it is in the book. We discussed this very clearly, that I've come to call the top left graph the sort of crocodile mouth challenge, right? So
Right.
the dotted line is South Africa's is a base to 100 growth rates relative to our comparator economies. And of course, the bottom jaw is South Africa's growth rate, GDP per capita indexed, as I said. You see that we've grown, just under 2% over sort of 10-year period. You can take this for a longer period, and we still look very poor relative to other emerging markets. Now, that for me lies at the core of our challenge. What it delivers, and here at the bottom, I've just shown you sort of COVID type numbers. It delivers weak employment growth or insufficient employment growth. And so where we are now is sort of about 700,000 jobs have been lost, sort of looking at the second quarter to the fourth quarter of the 2020 period. But really, we haven't gotten, so if you compare if you compare our performance to the fourth quarter of 2019, we haven't really recovered. So we're at a stage where essentially we haven't gotten back the jobs lost due to COVID. But the key question, Ferial, is the one I want to answer, and I've been grappling with it through the period when international observers thought our data was wrong. So our unemployment rate is consistently, let's call it 25%. I'll come back to that later on if we have a chance to talk about more recent statistics. But that's inordinately high. But the data is correct. So the only statistical corollary that is also an outlier, so where South Africa looks very different to other developing countries, is the fact that we have a very small informal sector. So the fact that 25% of people work in the informal sector in South Africa is much, much lower than other developing countries. So just to complete that thought, other countries are not much, much better at converting growth into employment. What we call the output employment elasticity for South Africa is about 0.7. 1% growth gives you a 0.7% increase in employment. That's not bad. It's not bad compared to other countries. The level may be low, but the conversion rate's not. So what's going on? Well, if you pick a developing country anywhere in Latin America and South Asia, upwards of 60% of the workforce, 60% are in the informal sector. So we have this obtuse outcome where the informal sector is actually too small. It's that sector that does the job of what we call closing the labor market, because it's easy, low barriers to entry, as we call it. It's easy to go in, open a business, and start working. Whereas in South Africa, it's not easy, actually. There are all sorts of reasons, we can get into that, but we have too small an informal sector. Mtse has heard me go on and on about this, but we prefer a notion of organized formal development. We want shopping malls, but we don't like hundreds of people outside our homes selling us stuff. We have this very different view of the informal sector.
And of what a job is. So is it your core thesis then that are we undercounting this fortune at the bottom of the pyramid, or do we really have an informal sector that's underdeveloped, and that is where not only employment, but as you write, self-employment may lie?
Yes, I don't think we're undercounting these individuals. I think that the challenge here is that there literally are too few individuals in the informal sector, and how this expresses itself is in very high unemployment rates. Now, we can go on in terms of the reasoning and why that's historically been the case, but in essence, it's not a data issue. We have too few people in self-employment.
I'd love to hear more about that. So greet some more people. Amanda Molete, welcome. Lolo Papo, Andrew Marcantonis, Lucky Masijo, Joan Krupp. Look forward to your questions in a little while. Mcebisi, may I start where you end in your chapter? You say there is no more runway. The events of July 2021 show that citizens can no longer be held to ransom by factional dynamics within the governing party and by a state struggling to maintain essential infrastructure and deliver basic services to the poor. Having 70% of our youth without jobs places democracy itself in the firing line. We need heightened political activism for a new development vision that collectively binds us, rebuilds trust, and activates new and creative forms of collaboration. Underpinning this new societal vision must be a social contract with accordant trade-offs for faster and sustained growth, greater wealth equality, and strengthened democracy. This is our only route to a different and better future. Unpack that for us, and specifically for me, the trade-offs, because those are quite essential questions.
Again, when I step back, I was trying to do that at some point. I'll come back to the question. Our crisis, and Haroon, we've debated this a lot. Our economic crisis, I think, has many factors, causing it, underlying it. The first, I think, is that as a country, we went through a long-term commodities down cycle. Globally, there was a long-term commodity down cycle, which resulted in stagnant growth in South Africa and weak revenue since 2012, actually. Right. We are in an upcycle now, but the reality is that even the benefit that we can get out of that is undermined by our port infrastructure and of course logistics capabilities that have been undermined over time. The second, I think, is deep structural weaknesses in our society, in our economy. Over dependence on commodities, exports, excessive market concentration, and of course inefficiencies in our network industries, and poor human development outcomes, which is very important, I think, to highlight. The third is our messy politics and disruptive politics. Of course, you can put on top of that state capture, because I think it's an outcome of that, and that has undermined business confidence, but also weakened the state completely to deal with what it's supposed to deal. Of course, as if that was not enough, we went into COVID-19 and its impacts, and then we now we have the Ukraine war. The Ukraine-Russia war, which actually in itself, further triggers supply chain disruptions. It also oil shortages in various markets, and also triggering a global inflationary upcycle, which again, you're likely to see low investment flows to South Africa and to markets like ourselves, as it were. And my own issue, that's the core of our problem. Of course, the chapter that I deal with the politics, of the political economy, and which is like probably one of the factors that I raised there. How do you get out of this? I think probably that could be the key question. My view is that I think you can look at how we're responding to the current thing about the president and the money is hidden and so on and so on and so on. The reality of the matter, I think, in my view, is that until we have a vision and a perspective that transcends the ruling party, and that's embraced by society as a whole, we are not going to break out of where we are. And in fact, I think there's the political parties, particularly the ruling party, is over-concentrated on its own internal dynamics. And there's very little focus on trying to look at mobilizing and galvanizing society towards a common developmental direction. Now, the state capture, the anti-state capture activism created the platform for doing that, because you had civil society coming on board, and you have people looking at the state and state capacity and all these issues. But unfortunately, I think because I think we still have a party-centered model of growth, and remember that I think economic policy really depends on the party. It would seem, you know what I mean? And the engagements that you have with society to create and hammer common understanding, common vision, is not something that we're strong on. And I guess the point I was trying to make is that I think we need to open up the conversation, break the parameters and confines of party politics, and also I think you also have individualism. A lot of kind of cult of personality within the politics themselves, which also almost aggravates the problem. Because people are looking at what the big personalities are doing, and it becomes a topical issue and yet we're missing a very important opportunity, because there is a crisis. Everybody realizes that we need to change tact, we need to change direction, and one of the trade-offs that we think about is that if we could probably have a society that begins to prioritize education, that ensures that every poor family has access to good education, the impact on poverty will be so huge. And how do you kind of structure a deal that allows you to prioritize education beyond where we are? There might be a couple of trade-offs in between around what deal you structure with the teachers, training, and communities, and their participation with municipalities contributing to education beyond where they are, what they are now. The other one is probably, you think about it, is just deregulating certain sectors of the economy. So that you allow growth, in those sectors.
Many questions here on whether you can have private sector participation in transport, for example. But what I do want to ask you is, how do we unyoke our political imagination from seeing our world, the world, only through ANC eyes? It's a 30-year habit almost 30-year habit that needs to be broken. Or do you think circumstances are breaking that? The November 21 election was, for me, quite a watershed, where four key capitals are no longer under ANC. They no longer run by the ANC. They run by coalitions of different parties. Haroon, many questions on labour market. If we could just get that answer from Mcebisi, please.
Look, let's face it, Ferial. The truth is that the state capture activism around state capture was not led by the ANC. So if you think about it, it was a societal movement that actually created an environment where everybody realized that that path was not sustainable. And my view is that I think it's still the momentum in society, in the media and everybody else and so on and so on, that combined, that is actually ensuring that we continue in the path of fighting corruption and actually possibility of state capture version 2, if it's no longer in motion, as it were. So for me, that tells you something. I think there was a thing about the flag that I watched, how, just the momentum in social media and everywhere else quickly led to a process where a proposition where government withdrew it quite quickly. So that shows the potential if we act together and really kind of start a momentum of being vocal about what we don't want in society, but also getting into a space where we were active. I think it's very clear that the future, it's very clear that anything short of a new movement, political movement, a new front, whether it's civil society front, whether it's a front that seeks to contest in election, is what will actually wake up politicians. Because at the moment, I think there's still this idea that liberation movements are permanent.
Yes, there is.
They have an inherent liberation movement, by the way, have an inherent weakness, because they are the liberators. They tend to assume that they define morality, they define ethics. Whereas, in a democracy, it is citizenry that is supposed to define morality and define what ethics should be about.
Absolutely.
And I don't think we've made that shift in South Africa. To add on top of that, in the book, I think at the beginning of the chapter, I make a comment about the fact that philosophically, liberation movements come from an understanding that the state is an instrument of class rule. And I think once you get into power, you replace class rule with party rule. That's why it's difficult to get out of debates around deployment, etc. Until you again assert a notion that says the state is about citizens as a whole, and every citizen has a right, equal to everybody in terms of this thing. So as you dynamize our politics and you change maybe the electoral system, we probably might reach that very quickly. Thanks.
I study Dr. Imtiaz Sooliman quite a bit, Haroon, and I see in how gift of the givers is understood in society and supported as well, that we are beginning to see those shifts. But may I run through quite a few questions for you from Brennan Williams. Do the panelists see the entrepreneurial support ecosystem as being effectively structured? How can we change the government's mind to support and enable development instead of getting in the way? And you have many ideas in your chapter, Haroon. And then, so that's suppliers. Then, since the Afrikaner Socialists introduced grants in the 30s, the ANC government has maintained and extended that system, and this prevents grinding poverty for the unemployed, but a job is much better than a grant. Just how do we encourage self-employment when young people are subject to a poor education system and are not prepared for the job market? And from Danny Cohen, just find that. I'll come back to Danny. So, what can we do to ignite and ensure that government values the informal sector? Thanks, Haroon. Those are mostly for you.
Yes, thanks, Ferial. I mean, maybe just to step back a little bit and touching on what Mcebisi's reflected on. I mean,
Yes.
and to some extent, the book attempts to do that, right? Which is, can we as South Africans move us towards what I call second order policy solutions? So in other words, we know and move beyond analysis, right? Which is what you started out at the outset
Yes.
with. So every chapter engages with an expert. So whether it's Transnet, whether it's the labor market, the informal sector, Eskom, we engage with the expert, but you'll notice that in every chapter they were asked very specifically, and I think some of the chapter authors are on this webinar, they were asked, yes, analyze, but spend a lot of time giving us solutions.
Oh, was that the brief, the editorial
Exactly.
brief? It's
That was a
written
very
that way.
clear editorial brief. So when you ask a question about the informal sector, some of those questions that you posed are actually tied up with competition policy, because you can't get, for example, more micro enterprise involvement if you've got a highly concentrated economy. So then we've got a chapter which argues, well, what are the 3 or 4 big things you need to do to look at concentration levels in the economy? How do you improve competition policy and its impact? Just some of the things around the informal sector. Again, I just want to be clear that this seems like a very strange space to be operating in, where you're arguing for a bigger informal sector.
Yes.
That's not what developing country policymakers around the world think of, right? Because they want to formalize the informal sector usually. Here's one example I always give, Ferial, which is,
Yes.
I tell my students, when you look at the parking lot of the School of Economics building, what's the problem? And I said to them, the problem is that there are too many cars there. There's only cars, in fact. Because if this was any other developing country city, there'd be people teeming all over the place selling you stuff. And the reason, and that's where the solution comes in, they can't do it is because the municipal bylaws don't allow it. In fact, one of the first things to do is to recast municipal bylaws. Now we get into the trenches of doing policy, but that's really important. Those are the second order things. If you change municipal bylaws that don't prevent the informal sector from operating, people will find spaces. The other thing we do is we charge people for hawker's license, right? You need to zero rate hawker. Why should you pay a registration fee if you're in the informal sector to operate your business? I think the president mentioned this in the SONA as well. So in addition, there are a whole range, and again, we get into the detail, but the detail is important. There are a whole range of things that the informal sector requires, such as storage facilities, such as ablution facilities, crime prevention, that city governments need to provide. If they don't provide it, well, then you're not facilitating the growth of the informal sector, and you are putting up a barrier to effectively reducing our unemployment rate. That's the way in which we need to see the connections, right? Is think hard and very specifically about the policy choices that need to be made. If I could just use the platform, Ferial.
Yes, of course.
To talk about, so for example, there's a great chapter on Transnet. The author,
By Derek Thomas, huh?
yes, he's now the advisor to the CEO of Transnet. But I'll just run through. It's not my area. This is Derek's area. But just to give you a sense of the specificity, how do you fix Transnet? He says, appointment of senior executives to manage important revenue-generating assets and operations. Reduce bloated managerial and bureaucratic costs. He's saying that it's too inefficient, right? Transnet port terminals need to be specialized along specific commodities, right, for handling and volume. There needs to be a security levy on customers for greater protection of the rail infrastructure. Transnet needs to advocate for robust state intervention in intelligence and enforcement, right? Resolve the legacy of state capture, which we've spoken about earlier. And then finally, greater private sector participation in Transnet's infrastructure and operations. Now, that sounds like, well, that's just too much detail for me. Well, then my view, and I think that was the book's view, is we're on the right track. Because if we don't make specialists very clear, focused policy interventions, we're going to keep on arguing in generalities, whether it's about education.
We seem to prefer generalities, and yet, like you say, it's the hard yards. So, Mcebisi, if I may come back to you, you seem to be advocating for a more muscular, a different black empowerment. So I've been reading a lot on emerging capitalism or better market-based systems. And it strikes me that, well, that we still have an economy of the post-colony as enunciated best, I think, by Professor Achille Mbembe. And I'm wondering if business leaders like you, like Greg, or the people in the book, are you radical enough in the reshaping which needs to happen? Because my view is in the past 30 years, we perhaps have not reshaped substantially enough from the inherited economy.
Look, I mean, it's a complex. I guess it's a complex debate.
Sure.
But I think part of the point that could have come out strongly is the fact that black wealth really depends on the state.
Right.
Basically, I mean that's and I think until you kind of change that perception, that view, to actually begin to kind of make it a concern for everybody. I mean, including big business and everybody else, is that. So, and that to me is at the core of many of the problems that you have. So the state capture happens because all what you need to do is to capture the state and to capture
Transnet, Eskom,
and so on and so on, and therefore you could direct growth and wealth for certain individuals. And I guess in the other message probably that didn't come out very strongly, and I probably must emphasize, is that I still feel that sections of business need to embrace the importance of transformation and make it part of their agenda to open up their supply chains, and create supply development programs, just to ensure that you diversify your suppliers in a sense, and therefore it will have an impact on a whole range of other things. Of course, I mean, the ANC has to emphasize to reprioritize growth. Because I think part of the problem that Haroon is talking about, low growth, I believe that, so you have on the other hand, probably non-prioritization of transformation. On the other hand, you have a government that doesn't really prioritize growth, as it were. I think it's only in the last 2 years that I've seen growth featuring strongly in sonas, in speeches. It used to be probably treasury or finance speech, basically.
No, like it's a bad word often in the alliance.
To use, but it's interesting. It's because I think if you look at the period, and that's a point I make. If you look at the period where there was growth, even if it was generated by the commodity boom in that period, contrary to the view that there was a jobless growth, job numbers grew in that period. Yes. So growth matters. You just cannot escape the importance of driving growth, as it were. But again, I mean, growth without transformation has its own limitations. And if we don't address these issues in tandem, we are likely to have instability.
Thank you. So a question from Peter Stewart, Haroon. It can be argued that all the reforms considered in the book will merely produce an extension of your middle class to 35% of South Africans, and then what happens to the others? A question, what's the role of the NHI in addressing the inequalities and improving health outcomes? And then question for you, after from Nikita Mpenyana, if civil society takes over the delivery of services and takes this leadership role, what do we do about our taxes which we pay to the state? So maybe we could address those. Haroon?
Yeah, so I think economic growth is hard enough, right? Ricardo Hausman from Harvard always says, never mind trying to make it inclusive, or never mind trying to make it sustainable, and so on. So I think, as MJ has said, just the idea of getting us moving beyond 2% growth rates, right? You look at the evidence from from China to India, now Vietnam, economic growth is the closest thing you have to a magic bullet, right? And this is not a new thinking. I mean, this is well known. So if we're moving ourselves appreciably towards 5, 6, 7% growth rates on a quarterly basis, you are going to see reductions in unemployment rates. You are going to see, with the policy fixes that we're proposing,
yes,
a greater involvement of all individuals across the income distribution, right? That's just the way economic growth works. I think it's true. You've got to be careful about the nature of growth once you get it going, and make sure that you, and that's part of the book's overview, right? Make sure that you unlock economic growth in those parts of the income distribution that are going to bring jobs to the fore and reduce inequality. So that's the stuff about the informal sector, about competition policy, and so on. The question about the NHI, I urge people to read the chapter by Andrew Donaldson, who, as you know, was the former head of the Budget Office at National Treasury. He's got an excellent, again, I like dry, Ferial. I don't like sort of headlights and neon lights. It's very dry, like my chapter.
You're going to struggle as a journalist, eh?
Yeah, because he takes you through the very simple numbers about why you need a private-public arrangement, a partnership, a PPP, if you want to think of anything that's going to make that's going to be a feasible NHI, right? And he speaks to the numbers, and he talks to the way in which the health system currently works, the number of individuals that are covered and not covered by private medical care. And you see very clearly that the expertise, the infrastructure that exists in the private sector, you want to harness rather than replace. And it's very carefully argued. So I urge everybody to read that if you're interested in the NHI.
Thank you. So, Mclear, the question on the role of civil society, and I guess is, what do you do when we have an economy, a developing economy with quite high rates of tax, and often you can see that wasted? So how do you fix a binary that often comes up where civil society is stepping into the gap, doing all this work? And then I guess from me is, data can be a real driver of growth. Have we done enough to bring down the cost of data? And what are the roles of telcos in this regard? I mean, that's a question quite close to your heart and your work, I'm sure.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, can I start? I mean, clearly, Ferial, I mean, I guess the overriding point we make right through the book is the significance of enhancing state capacity. I mean, because I think whether you're talking about Transnet, Eskom, and whatever, ultimately what undermines the development efforts at the moment, in my view, is the absence of state capacity. Now, how do you do that? I mean, we made in the book, there are concrete suggestions across the board. I mean, if you take crime, I mean, people saying professionalize the police, basically. Because I think, and professionalizing the police also implies that I think you look beyond the borders for the training and enhancement of capacity and systems, etc., etc. I mean, if you take, for instance, the NPA, the truth of the matter is that South Africa has not been producing prosecutors over a long period of time, actually. I think if you have the best, I mean, so you do need some skilling. And in many countries, there's a dedicated effort to become a prosecutor in the US or anywhere else. You go through a very rigorous process to actually develop that capability, as it were. So professionalization of civil society, of the state, is a very important, of the bureaucracy, is a very important part of that. The second part, I think, is about just refocusing the bureaucracy in areas that are critical. I mean, so you're professionalizing, but on the other hand, you need to ensure that there are certain critical areas like project management,
supply chain management,
etc., etc. That in the short term you could focus that. Haroon is correct. You could do that in partnership with the private sector, but also you could actually use bilateral agreements that we have as a country to actually bring those skills into those
May
skills.
I ask you a question? Okay. As we see more coalition governments being formed, does that improve the opportunity to professionalize? Because to be honest, I cover Joburg a lot just because I'm interested in it. And cadre deployment is a very real thing. It was until November last year. It was really, every time a roads agency, a city power job, you'll find ANC cadres, usually with nowhere else to go, being put into those roles. Do you think coalition governments offer a greater opportunity for professionalization?
I think it's still early. I think
Yes.
in the medium long term it will, but at the moment I still think that political dominance still almost like impede the potential value that we could get out of coalition politics. I mean, if you take what's happening in Nelson Mandela Bay,
Yes.
I think you have 2 municipal managers, etc., etc. Actually, it can be a chaos, basically.
And it's going to run out of water in 2 weeks.
In 2 weeks. And so on and so on. So my point is that I think over time people might actually begin to learn that it's possible to co-govern and it's possible to focus on the basic good schools, good education, good health, knows no ideology. So,
Absolutely.
So it's across,
Haroon,
everybody wants to have that.
Haroon, thank you very much. Haroon, I wanted to ask a little more about your chapter because there's some really big thinking in it. You, for example, do not think the CETA system has done very well. And you do say that our economy is choking from a lack of critical skills. We need to unblock the pipeline. But again, we have a project going at Daily Maverick on home affairs at the moment, and it's a real system blocker. How do we fix that?
Yeah, so maybe in fact to pick up what Mcebisi is saying now, just to add on to it, like one of the challenges is designing regulations or policy framework on the assumption that you have a highly efficient, effective state. Now, I think it could have been aspirational in 1994, but we can argue now that if you design such a system and the state has not only been unable to become more efficient, but in fact has deteriorated because of state capture, then you are in real trouble. So what do I mean in practice? Well, you've got a visa system, right? So a general work visa and a scarce skills visa system in order to attract or allow companies to bring in skilled workers that is reliant on an effective, functional government department and associated systems, such as a database of unemployed people who may have similar skills. That current database, just to give you a window into it, Ferial, is an Excel spreadsheet that is incomplete, and there's a manual process that is supposed to match when an employer says they want to bring in an engineer from Japan. There's a manual system that's supposed to say, well, does that engineer from Japan actually, with those skill sets, exist in South Africa? It's completely dysfunctional at all levels, right? And there's also a lack of innovation around policy thinking. So the view I personally hold is that employers should determine their labor demand needs, right? I always give the example of the economics department here. There may be a surplus of economists in the country, but I can tell you that the economic department at UCT has a shortage of really good time series macroeconomists. That's not going to be in any database,
Yeah.
right? That a
Software
government,
developers, whatever.
exactly, that a government department runs. So let the employer decide who they need, and you can issue either quotas, so a certain number of individuals should be allowed per the company sort of size, and you proceed from that basis. This idea that government can decide what labor demand and skills needs are of companies, let alone sectors, is foolhardy. And then when you add to that the fact that you've got a government department and a government system that lacks capacity, right? Both in terms of things like information systems, but also skill sets, and is incredibly slow in communicating with companies, then you've got a sort of scarce skills need meets a dysfunctional state problem, right? And that's what I think you see playing out in the sort of public sphere.
Absolutely. So I'm going to run us through many questions, and maybe you could each take a couple because there's lots and we're getting up to the hour. So David Bosman, is it not time for a Singaporean model, a meritocracy? Danny Cohen, what do you think of government's focus on the social compact? Also from Danny, what about the focus on localization? Isn't it just more protectionism? I don't know if chicken prices have gone up as a result. If everybody knows what should be done to increase growth, why doesn't the change happen in government? And what about social cohesion? From Tumakele Gosa, how do we reconcile the varying interests in our society and civil society? Because we do have conflicting interests. So how to build social cohesion? How can governance leadership be inspired in service to the people? That's more of a comment. And then, hi, Mr. Jonas and Prof. Bhorat, thanks a lot for this. One of the key things we hear about getting things done and making choices is the need for political will. Do we have such political will? There is sufficient, from Vishanti Saupal, there's sufficient evidence that growth in itself does not ensure human well-being. I think you touched on that, Haroon. Maybe we could take a couple of those as we begin to conclude. Okay, do you want to go first?
Okay. Look, I mean, I'll start off with the social compact question. You know, I guess, I mean, the core of the social compact should be being able to accommodate growth and transformation at the same time within that. And growth could only happen through thoroughgoing reforms, structural reforms in our economy. And I always argue that we probably also need to revisit our notion of Black empowerment, I think. Because I guess I think we've come out of a model where Black empowerment is driven by the state. It's also driven by financial structuring in banks, etc. And I think if you see the first round and the impact that it has not necessarily generated much, as it were. So part of what the social compact should do is really combine the two. I mean, the issue need for growth through structural reform and the transformation question. Thirdly, I think issues like education. I feel that, I mean, the struggle against apartheid, I always say this thing that if there's anything that societies and communities converged around, it was education. And I think post-apartheid, I think struggle tended to downplay the importance of mobilizing communities and society behind a very clear prioritization of education, as it were. And it has to be a conscious effort where there are certain trade-offs we make, and there's a particular focus on this thing, on education, and there's certain skills that we encourage our schools to focus on, etc., and the administration and management of education across the board, as it were. So part of that social compact should start defining that. And definitely health and transport, I would say, should be another part of that big social compact that you're talking about. I'll come back to the question on meritocracy
Yes.
again, just to end off. It's very clear. I mean, it's very clear that we do need to bring capability into key areas within the state. And in order to do that, I think we must also appreciate that deployment has run its course.
Right.
It was useful at a particular point in time. It has been corrupted pretty much. And I think we need to really look at how do we uncompromisingly build skills in certain critical areas within the state in order to drive growth and development. At the same time, I think the success of that will lie also back on still taking into cognizance more creative way of growing a new entrepreneurial black class that actually is able to see a stake in the bigger development, as it were. Political will, I mean, I don't know.
Do we have it? Is there political will now?
It's a bit of a complex thing, I think, political will, because I think one way of looking at it will be to look at an individual. But I guess political will is also subject to leadership, which is broader than just emphasizing on the cult of personality. You have essentially politics that are flawed, and they produce. And if you think about it, I mean, there's a book by one American, I don't forget the name, but it's interesting because it looks at political parties over the years and say that when they were effective, it was because they were able to filter leadership, you know? And
yes.
so you would not have particular kinds of people making it up to the top. And I would not want to make examples of names. But what has happened over time, I mean, in different parts of the world, that filtering role of political parties has almost like been compromised so badly that you could have a Trump getting through the ranks and becoming a president of the biggest economy in the world. And you could say we have our own examples in the country where that. So you see, if you look at the mayors generally, I mean, across political parties, sometimes you ask yourself, how did they make it? But it's because I think political parties have their internal systems have almost collapsed, the principles of collapse, and it's almost like free for all. I mean, you get the West who actually rise through the ranks as a result without that filtering capability that they used to have. And probably that fixing that actually comes back to how do you rebuild that filtering role? And I don't think it lies within political parties. It lies outside of political parties. Political parties that produce and give society bad leaders should not be voted for. It's a simple thing. And so consciousness of civil society and society should be heightened around that.
There's a Chris Papas in KwaZulu-Natal, a number of other young mayors who I think are really showing what good filtering can do, but maybe that's for another day. I'm seeing some real stars coming up. Haroon, if I could ask you just to run us through Lindelwa Jabbar was saying, can you comment on the future of the agriculture sector? There's a great chapter in the book on that. Huh?
Yes, there is Ferial. I mean, and certainly I'm the worst person for that because one day.
Are you not a farmer in your part time?
I wish I was. I wish I was.
Okay.
I partake in the output, but not the input side. But let me run through. I mean, Wandile talks about creating a consolidated fund to crowd in resources from various government initiatives, the public, including private sector capital. There's that theme again, right? Private-public partnerships. To finance rural infrastructure. So that's his very clear focus because you've got a lack of rural infrastructure. He wants to strengthen land rights and provide comprehensive support to black farmers, but particularly those at the medium level. He says you've got to improve capacity at local and provincial levels of government in terms of support to agriculture, strengthen climate smart agriculture, and then reduce food insecurity. So for me, that's like, that's exactly the kind of level of detail that you're going to find in the chapter. If I could just pick up on some of the comments I'm seeing,
Yes, please.
Ferial. I mean, we have to accept that we've locked ourselves not only into a low growth trap, but a style of growth that involves something, and I've said this before, but it hasn't really changed, something along the lines of, with the low growth we have in ever shrinking tax base, the only way to maintain a society with such inordinately high unemployment rates and inequality levels is to use the tax base and fund social grants at an ever increasing rate, right? And introduce new grants to keep the lid on social exclusion and inequality.
Is it sustainable?
It is not sustainable. So if you read Michael Sachs's chapter, it's fiscally not sustainable. We have argued very clearly through the Presidential Economic Advisory Council that this is not sustainable for all sorts of reasons, right? Even if you look at the modeling work that's been done, it's not feasible, right? So that is why doing something aside from this sort of standard, how do we deal with high unemployment rates? Let's plug the system with social grants.
Yes.
It's just.
But what about the public employment opportunities, the presidential employment initiative? Millions of people.
Yeah, but there's a limit to that, Ferial, because the only, globally, we are not alone in this, right? Globally, 7 to 9 jobs, in some countries even 9.5 jobs in a country, developing or developed, comes from the private sector, right? We have to lock onto that. The state cannot be a provider of jobs. It's just, that's a recipe for all sorts of problems down the line, whether it's fiscal problems or the kinds of things you saw in North Africa and the Middle East, right?
Yes.
So we have to think creatively around particularly the kinds of ideas that Mcebisi has brought up now, which is broader-based Black economic empowerment, inclusion of the informal sector, and stop this notion that somehow, if you are, and it's going to be very controversial, but if you're a union member, right, in the mining industry, you are earning at the 85th percentile of this distribution, right? You are not part of the poor, and for the idea that you need to think
the upper quartile, huh?
Exactly. So if you need to think of where the individuals and households we need to focus on, those are not unionized. They're in the informal sector. They're in rural areas. And the only way is to unlock private-public partnerships for growth and employment. And I don't think we've done that. And hopefully the book gives us some ideas.
Definitely, lots of ideas. Thank you very much, Haroon. Mcebisi, you take us home from one people who joined us. Clairwyn says, listening to this webinar gives me some hope for our future. Wherein lies hope in the next few years? And if I may just say, Better Choices, now on sale, and I saw it doing very well at my local bookshop. Final word to you, Mcebisi.
Look, I mean, I think we are a very resilient society. I think I always say that after having said everything, I travel a lot these days.
Yes.
Because of my job. I think what I find interesting about South Africa, despite all the negative things that we say about the state, about political parties, etc., I would yet to see a single political party in South Africa that is not concerned about the plight of the poor, the unemployed, etc. I would yet to see one political party in South Africa that is not concerned about the state of education, state of our economy, etc. So I guess maybe I always say, Haroon, that maybe it's a function of the dualism between economic power and political power. Because I think those who hold political power, in order to sustain themselves, they need to be voted. But it's a very positive, I think there is a very positive, if you like, spirit in South Africa about people caring and understanding the importance of lifting society, of growing, of redistribution of sorts, and so on and so on and so on. So that, to me, is a big thing. The question is, how do we capitalize on it in a more systematic way to generate some of the outcomes that we talk about in the book? That's probably the big challenge we have. And I am very optimistic that we'll get to that point, or we're getting to that point.
Inshallah, from your lips to God's ears. and also our good democracy. Thank you very much for joining us. The book's on sale in our bookshop on Daily Maverick Bookstore and also in shops. And thank you, Haroon, for focusing us on the detail, and Mcebisi for making sure we keep the vision alive. Really appreciate your time today. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks.